It was supposed to be an ordinary night, just another evening at home with my husband, Greg. We had been married for 5 years, and while our relationship wasn't perfect, it had always felt stable. Or so I thought. Greg was older than me by about 10 years, and he had a quiet, steady way about him. He wasn't one for grand gestures of love, but I didn't mind. We had a comfortable life together, and that was enough for me. We didn't have kids, though we talked about it a few times. Greg was always on the fence, claiming he wasn't sure he wanted the responsibility. I, on the other hand, was desperate to start a family, hoping it would bring us closer together. But Greg seemed to have other plans I would only discover in the most shocking way. It started a few weeks ago when Greg's nephew, Ryan, came to stay with us for a while. Ryan was in his early 20s, a college dropout who was trying to figure things out, as Greg put it. I had met him a handful of times at family gatherings, and he always struck me as a bit aimless but harmless. I didn't think much of him when Greg offered to let him crash with us for a few months. After all, he was family. At first, things were fine. Ryan was polite and quiet, mostly keeping to himself. He spent his days lounging around the house, watching TV, and playing video games in the living room. I tried to engage him in conversation a few times, asking him about his plans and whether he was thinking about going back to school, but he always gave me vague answers and quickly changed the subject. It was clear that he wasn't interested in my advice, and I didn't push it. Then, one night, everything changed. Greg had been acting distant for a few days, and I couldn't figure out why. He wasn't talking to me as much, and when he did, it was short and cold. I assumed he was stressed from work, but when I asked him about it, he just brushed me off. "It's nothing. Don't worry about it," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. I was hurt by his attitude, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I figured he'd come around eventually, so I tried to give him some space. Little did I know there was something much darker brewing beneath the surface. That night, Greg told me he was going out for a few drinks with some friends. I didn't think much of it. He often went out with his buddies to blow off steam. He left around 8 p.m., and I assumed he'd be back in a few hours. I settled in on the couch with a book, trying to relax and enjoy the quiet. But around 10 p.m., Ryan came into the living room. He was unusually chatty, asking me how my day had been and whether I wanted to watch a movie with him. I was a little surprised by his sudden interest in talking to me, but I didn't think much of it. After all, he'd been living with us for a few weeks now, and maybe he was finally starting to feel comfortable. We picked a movie and settled on the couch together, but as the minutes ticked by, I noticed Ryan was sitting closer to me than usual. So first I told myself I was imagining it, but then he shifted again, this time so close that our legs were touching. I tried to scoot over to give myself some space, but he just moved closer again. "Ryan, what are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, though I was starting to feel uneasy. He looked at me with a smirk that made my stomach churn. "Just getting comfortable," he said. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I wanted to get up and leave, but I didn't want to cause a scene. After all, he was Greg's nephew, and I didn't want to overreact. Maybe I was overthinking things. But then he put his hand on my leg, and all my doubts vanished. "Ryan, stop," I said firmly, pushing his hand away. He didn't listen. Instead, he leaned in closer, his breath hot against my ear. "Greg said it was okay," he whispered, his voice low and sickening. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Greg," Ryan said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He said you'd be up for it." Up for it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. There was no way Greg had given Ryan permission to touch me like this. It had to be some kind of sick joke. But the look on Ryan's face told me it wasn't a joke. He was dead serious. When I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, "You need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But Ryan didn't move. Instead, he grabbed my wrist, his grip tight and unrelenting. "Come on, don't be like that," he said, pulling me back down onto the couch. I tried to resist, but he was stronger than I expected. My heart was pounding in my ears, and for a moment I felt completely helpless. But then I remembered my phone on the coffee table. If I could just reach it. He lunged for the phone, but Ryan was faster. He grabbed it before I could and tossed it across the room. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and menacing. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized just how trapped I was. Greg wasn't coming back anytime soon, and Ryan had no intention of letting me go. I tried to reason with him, begging him to stop, but he just laughed. "Greg said you'd be like this," he sneered. "He said you'd play hard to get." My mind was spinning. How could Greg have done this? How could he have betrayed me like this? The man I had married, the man I had trusted with my heart, had given his nephew permission to. I couldn't even finish the thought. It was too horrifying. If you like this story, comment your opinion in the comments section. Ryan's hands were all over me now, and no matter how much I fought, I couldn't break free. He was too strong, and I was too scared. I wanted to scream, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, and no one would hear me. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard the front door open. My heart leaped into my throat. Greg was home. He would stop this. He had to stop this. But when Greg walked into the living room and saw what was happening, he didn't react the way I expected. He didn't yell at Ryan or rush to my side to help me. Instead, he just stood there, watching us with a cold, detached expression on his face. "Greg, help me," I sobbed, trying to push Ryan away. But Greg didn't move. He didn't say a word. So Ryan glanced over at his uncle, a smirk spreading across his face. "Told you she'd be up for it," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. Greg just shrugged. "Don't fight it, babe," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "It's better if you just go along with it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own husband, was standing there, watching as his nephew assaulted me, and he didn't care. In fact, he seemed to be encouraging it. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. I had trusted Greg with everything, and this was how he repaid me. By letting his nephew treat me like some kind of toy. My mind couldn't process it. It was too much. For the rest of the night, I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. Ryan didn't stop, and Greg didn't lift a finger to help me. It was as if I was invisible to him, nothing more than an object to be used and discarded. When it was finally over, Ryan got up and left the room without a word, leaving me lying on the couch, broken and shattered. When I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. All I could do was lie there, numb and in shock. Greg sat down next to me, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't that bad, was it?" he asked, his tone casual as if we had just had a normal night. I couldn't even look at him. I felt sick to my stomach, disgusted by the man I had married. How had I not seen this side of him before? How had I been so blind? In the days that followed, I tried to confront Greg about what had happened, but he always brushed me off. "You're overreacting," he'd say. "It was just one night. No big deal." No big deal. That's what he called it. A night of horror. A night that shattered everything I thought I knew about my marriage. And to him, it was nothing. I knew I had to leave, but I didn't know how. Greg had always been the one in control of our finances, and I had nowhere else to go. I felt trapped, just like I had that night with Ryan, but I couldn't stay. Not after what had happened. It took me weeks to gather the courage to leave, but eventually I did. I packed a small bag when Greg was at work, leaving behind most of my belongings. None of the material things mattered anymore. I needed to get out, to breathe, to feel free from the weight of betrayal and disgust that had been crushing me ever since that night. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out the door and never looked back. For days, I stayed with a close friend, too ashamed and terrified to tell her the truth about what had happened. How could I explain it? How could I make sense of the fact that my husband had allowed his own nephew to violate me and had stood by watching as though I were nothing more than a disposable object? But the nightmares wouldn't leave me alone. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that couch, Ryan's on me, Greg watching with that cold, detached expression. So I started losing weight. My friend noticed, and one night, after seeing me break down into tears at the dinner table, she pressed me until I finally told her everything. She was horrified. I could see the shock and anger in her eyes, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. Someone else knew. Someone else could see how wrong it all was. She insisted I go to the police, but I was terrified. What if they didn't believe me? What if they said it was my fault, that I hadn't fought hard enough, that I should have done something to stop it? I had heard stories on the news of women being dismissed, shamed, even blamed for their own assaults. So the idea of reliving that night in front of strangers was too much to bear. Eventually, though, I knew I had no choice. My friend took me to the local police station, and I filed a report. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done. I had to recount every detail of that horrific night, answer invasive questions, and try to keep my emotions in check as the officers wrote everything down. To my surprise, the police took my case seriously. They opened an investigation and reached out to Greg and Ryan. I didn't know what to expect, but part of me hoped desperately that Greg would be arrested, that there would be some kind of justice for what he had done to me. But when Greg found out I had gone to the police, he turned it all around on me. He told them I was lying, that I had consented, that it was just a game we had played together. Ryan backed him up, of course. They both denied everything, twisting the truth in ways that made my head spin. Suddenly, I was the villain, the untrustworthy wife who had supposedly invited this nightmare into our home. The betrayal stung even more deeply. How could Greg lie like that? How could he look me in the eyes and deny what he had done? Weeks passed with no real progress in the case. The investigation dragged on, and I was left in a state of limbo, waiting for anything to happen. But nothing did. The police couldn't find enough evidence to press charges, and eventually the case was closed. Greg and Ryan walked away unscathed, while I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. But I wasn't going to let them win. I couldn't. If you like this story, comment your opinion in the comments section. So I started therapy, pouring out my pain and confusion to a compassionate counselor who helped me work through the trauma I had endured. It was slow going at first. I felt like I was reliving that night over and over again, but with time I began to heal. I learned to set boundaries, to reclaim my voice, to understand that what had happened was not my fault. I had been betrayed in the worst possible way, but I refused to let that betrayal define me. Meanwhile, Greg continued to try and contact me. He sent messages, left voicemails, and even showed up at my friend's house a couple of times, demanding to see me. He wanted to talk, to explain, but I knew there was nothing left to say. I ignored him, blocked his number, and eventually, with the help of my lawyer, filed for divorce. The divorce process was ugly. Greg fought me on every little detail, from our shared bank accounts to the house we had bought together. It was clear he wasn't going to make this easy for me, and there were times when I felt like giving up. But I didn't. I couldn't. One of the hardest parts was facing Greg in court. He sat there calm and collected, as though nothing had happened. He wore the same stoic expression he had the night he stood by while Ryan violated me. It took everything in me not to break down, to scream at him, to demand answers. But I held it together. I had to. The court ruled in my favor, and I was granted the divorce. It wasn't the justice I had hoped for, but it was a start. I walked away with my freedom, and that was enough for me. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild my life. I found a new place to live, got a job, and slowly started to piece myself back together. It wasn't easy. The memories of that night still haunted me, and there were days when I felt like I would never fully heal. But I had survived. I had made it through the worst, and I knew that, in time, the wounds would scar over. So I started reading stories on Reddit about others who had experienced betrayal. People who had been cheated on, lied to, or hurt by the ones they loved. It was oddly comforting, knowing I wasn't alone. There was a whole community of people out there who understood what it was like to be betrayed in such a profound way. Some of them shared stories far worse than mine, while others simply offered words of encouragement and support. It was on one of these late-night Reddit scrolling sessions that I came across a story about a woman whose husband had cheated on her with her best friend. The betrayal had devastated her, and like me, she had struggled to rebuild her life afterward. But what struck me most about her story was the way she had found healing. She had written about how, after the divorce, she had gone on to start a blog where she shared her experiences and helped others who had gone through similar situations. Inspired by her strength, I decided to do the same. I started my own blog, writing about my experiences with betrayal, the emotional scars left behind, and the process of healing. It was terrifying at first, putting my story out there for the world to see. But as I wrote, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The more I shared, the less power that night seemed to have over me. I wrote about Greg, about the cold way he had watched me suffer, and how I had fought to reclaim my life after he shattered it. I wrote about Ryan, about the smug look on his face as he violated me with Greg's approval. But most of all, I wrote about survival, about the strength it took to leave, to heal, and to keep going, even when everything felt hopeless. To my surprise, people began to read my blog. They reached out to me, sharing their own stories of betrayal, heartbreak, and survival. Some of them were in the middle of their own nightmares, and others had already made it to the other side. Their stories gave me strength, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. Now, every day is a battle, but it's a battle I'm winning. I have learned that betrayal doesn't define me. What Greg and Ryan did to me was horrific, but it doesn't get to dictate the rest of my life. I'm reclaiming my power, one day at a time. I don't know what happened to Greg and Ryan after the divorce. I don't care. They are part of my past, and I refuse to let them haunt my future. Instead, I focus on the people who matter, the ones who have supported me, believed me, and stood by me even when I couldn't stand on my own. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that betrayal doesn't make you weak. Surviving it makes you stronger than you ever knew you could be. If you like this story, comment your opinion in the comment section. Months passed, and the grip of Greg's betrayal began to loosen. Therapy became a place where I could not only express my pain but also understand the complexities of the emotions I was still carrying. The process was grueling, and there were days when I felt like I was back at square one. But each small step forward brought me closer to reclaiming my sense of self. Writing had become my refuge. My blog, once a timid experiment, had gained a modest but loyal following. People who had been through similar experiences found comfort in my words. I was no longer just a victim. I was someone who had endured the unimaginable and lived to tell the tale. One day, as I was responding to a reader's heartfelt comment, an unexpected email popped up in my inbox. It was from Ryan. For a long moment, I stared at his name on the screen, my heart racing, unsure if I should even open it. But curiosity got the best of me. With trembling fingers, I clicked the email. It was short, only a few lines, but those lines shook me to my core. _Hey, I've been thinking about everything that happened that night. I didn't know you'd feel this way. I thought it was something Greg wanted, and he said you were okay with it. I know it's probably too late, but I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. Call an apology, not a genuine one though. His words dripped with self-justification, as if my trauma could be brushed aside by his warped version of the events. And I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he had no right to absolve himself of what he had done, especially when he knew, deep down, that none of it was right. I deleted the email without replying. But the emotions it stirred up wouldn't go away. Ryan's words, pathetic as they were, brought back everything I had been trying to bury. I remembered his hands on me, the sickening feeling of helplessness, and Greg's icy indifference as he let it happen. Despite my healing, despite the progress I'd made, there were still pieces of me that remained broken. I spent the next few days in a daze, the weight of those memories hanging over me like a dark cloud. I knew I had to confront this in a way that would allow me to let it go, truly let it go. If you like this story, comment your opinion in the comment section. I spoke to my therapist about the email, and she helped me understand that closure doesn't always come from an apology. Sometimes closure is something you give yourself. Ryan's so-called apology was nothing more than an attempt to ease his guilt, but I didn't need his remorse to heal. I had already been doing the hard work, piece by piece, rebuilding my life. And so I made the decision to write about it. I shared the story of Ryan's email on my blog, detailing the impact his actions had on me, how his so-called apology only deepened the wounds. The responses were overwhelming. Readers flooded the comments with messages of support, sharing their own stories of receiving insincere apologies from those who had wronged them. The power of writing and community was something I had never expected. Each story shared, each message of solidarity, chipped away at the lingering hold that Greg and Ryan's betrayal had over me. I wasn't alone in my experience, and neither were the people who reached out to me. Around this time, I found myself drawn to Reddit more often, particularly subreddits where people shared their own experiences with betrayal and emotional abuse. One night, I stumbled across a post from a woman who had been in a similar situation. She had been cheated on and gaslit by her partner, who had convinced her that everything happening in their relationship was her fault. Her story hit so close to home that I couldn't help but reach out to her in the comments. What followed was a back-and-forth exchange that felt like a lifeline. We shared our stories, our fears, and our hopes for the future. We talked about how difficult it was to trust again, how hard it was to rebuild our lives after the people we loved the most had betrayed us in the most profound ways. And through it all, we reminded each other that we were survivors. It was in one of these late-night conversations that she suggested we collaborate on something bigger, a space where people like us could come together to share their experiences, find support, and maybe even find some peace. The idea intrigued me. I had found healing in writing and sharing my story, and I realized that others could too. Together, we created a website, a place where people could anonymously post their stories of betrayal, cheating, and emotional abuse. We called it the Healing Circle, and it quickly gained traction. People from all walks of life began sharing their experiences, finding solace in the knowledge that they weren't alone. The comments section became a place of comfort, where people offered support, empathy, and encouragement to one another. As the Healing Circle grew, I found myself stepping into a new role. I was no longer just a victim or a survivor. I was a guide, someone who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, ready to help others do the same. The website became a beacon for those who had been hurt, and I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. And yet, as I helped others, I continued to help myself. Every story I read reminded me that healing is a journey, not a destination. I no longer carried the weight of Greg and Ryan's betrayal like a burden I couldn't shake. Instead, it had become a part of my story, one chapter in a book that I was still writing. Eventually, the pain of that night faded into the background. It didn't define me anymore. I wasn't the woman who had been betrayed. I was the woman who had survived, who had taken her pain and turned it into something beautiful, something that could help others. Greg Ryan, the betrayal, it was all part of my past, but it wasn't my future. So my future was mine to write, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. If you like this story, comment your opinion in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Your support helps us continue to share these powerful narratives.